the eternal voice.
Before you subscribe and ring that notification bell, understand this. Some knowledge carries a weight that reshapes the vessel that contains it. Tonight, we extend an invitation to peer beyond the final veil, to trace the contours of gates that exist not in space but in the architecture of comprehension itself, the Gates of Azathoth, beyond which lies not revelation but the gentle dissolution of the very need for revelation. In the deepest chambers of cosmic horror's cathedral, past the familiar altars of Cthulhu's dreaming city and the scholarly corridors of Miskatonic's forbidden libraries, there exists a threshold so fundamental that it serves as the cornerstone of all other terrors. These are not gates in any sense your mind can comfortably inhabit, not bronze portals carved with hieroglyphs, not stellar apertures ringed with impossible geometries, but the ultimate boundary between existence and the primordial silence from which all things briefly emerge and to which they must inevitably return. The Gates of Azathoth represent the final membrane, the last gossamer thread that separates ordered reality from the nuclear chaos that dreams it into being. They are simultaneously the source and destination of all cosmic horror, the point where terror transforms from external threat into structural revelation. What makes these gates particularly insidious is their nature as both metaphor and mechanism. They exist wherever consciousness encounters the absolute limit of what it can contain without fragmenting into constituent elements. Picture the moment when a child first comprehends infinity, when the mind stretches toward a horizon that recedes with each step of understanding. This is the psychological topology of Azathoth's gates. They open not outward into space, but inward into the observer, revealing that the seeker and the sought are movements in the same cosmic jest. The gates exist in every instant when you glimpse the arbitrary nature of physical constants, when you sense the gossamer fragility of the reality you've been taught to trust as bedrock. At the center of this labyrinth sits Azathoth itself, the blind idiot god, the demon sultan whose unconscious dreams constitute the totality of existence. But the gates we speak of tonight transcend even this ultimate entity, for they represent the threshold beyond which even chaos reveals its deeper nature. In Lovecraft's original vision, Azathoth piped and danced in the ultimate void, attended by the maddening music of alien flutes. Yet the gates suggest something more profound, a boundary beyond which even the concept of beyond loses coherence. The stage we construct tonight is illuminated by the cold light of distant stars, those ancient fires that burn like candles in the vast cathedral of space. Listen carefully, and you might hear it, the faint, discordant music that underlies all symphonies, the rhythm that your heartbeat unconsciously follows, the melody that teaches silence its most profound lessons. This is the sound that leaks through the gates, not as invasion but as invitation, a whisper that says the performance has already begun. The curtain rises on a theater where the audience discovers it has always been part of the cast. You are not merely observing this investigation, you are participating in it, contributing to it, becoming it. Each concept we explore together plants itself in the fertile darkness of your attention, taking root in ways that will only become apparent as we proceed deeper into territories where maps become meaningless and the cartographer risks becoming part of the territory they attempt to chart. The veil between fiction and philosophy grows gossamer thin in these regions. What begins as literary analysis transforms into consciousness research. What starts as entertainment evolves into a form of applied ontology. The gates exist at this intersection, where the academic and the experiential merge into something that transcends both categories, where footnotes become incantations and scholarship becomes a form of careful sorcery. Feel the weight of this moment, the particular quality of attention you bring to these words. the way the familiar boundaries of your awareness begin to soften at the edges like wax near flame. The fog rolls in from the harbor of consciousness, carrying with it the salt taste of ancient oceans and the metallic tang of starlight on water. These are not mere atmospheric details, but navigational aids, sensory anchors that will guide us through territories where conventional landmarks dissolve into their constituent uncertainties. The masks we wear in daily life, the personas, the roles, the comfortable identities, begin to feel less substantial here, more like costumes borrowed for a performance whose script is written in a language we're still learning to read. The stage is set, the audience is seated, and the curtain trembles with anticipation of what lies beyond its fabric, knowing that what waits there is not separate from what watches here. Tonight's journey promises no comfortable conclusions, no reassuring answers to wrap around yourself like a familiar blanket against the cold. Instead, we offer something far more valuable and infinitely more dangerous: the opportunity to participate in reality's ongoing investigation of itself, to become a conscious collaborator in the cosmic process of self-discovery that operates through every form of awareness, including your own. The gates await, patient as stone, inevitable as entropy. They do not call to you. They simply are, existing in the space between one breath and the next, in the pause between heartbeats, in the silence that gives meaning to all sounds. The only requirement for approaching them is the courage to continue reading, to continue listening, to continue being present to whatever unfolds in the space between these words and your reception of them, where meaning is born. The genealogy of these ultimate gates begins not in Lovecraft's Providence study, but in the spaces between his midnight letters, in the pauses between pen strokes where an idea too large for immediate expression gathered weight like storm clouds over an unsuspecting landscape. The concept emerged not as invention, but as excavation, multiple minds probing the same psychological territories, inevitably encountering the same fundamental threshold where thought meets its own impossibility. You can sense it even now, that peculiar heaviness in the air, when consciousness approaches its own boundaries, the way shadows seem to deepen in peripheral vision. Howard Phillips Lovecraft himself approached these gates obliquely, circling them in correspondence with Clark Ashton Smith and Robert Bloch, like a cartographer mapping the edges of an unmappable territory. In letters dated deep into New England winters, when the fog rolled thick enough to muffle footsteps and distort familiar geometries, he wrote of the demon sultan and the nuclear chaos, but always with the careful indirection of someone who understood that certain concepts resist direct confrontation. His pen would hesitate at crucial moments, as if the ink itself recoiled from certain formulations, leaving spaces where meaning gathered like condensation on cold glass. The transmission of this idea follows patterns that mirror its own nature. It spreads not through linear narrative, but through a kind of conceptual contagion, seeping from mind to mind like water finding its level. Each author who encountered the notion seemed compelled to approach it from a different angle, as if the gates themselves possessed a kind of agency that prevented any single perspective from achieving complete comprehension. The idea moved through literary circles with the persistence of fog, settling into the low places of consciousness, where doubt and wonder intersect. August Derleth, inheriting Lovecraft's literary estate, along with its philosophical implications, found himself in the peculiar position of systematizing what was fundamentally resistant to system. His attempts to create taxonomies and hierarchies around Azathoth revealed both the necessity and impossibility of such organizational efforts. The gates, it seemed, existed precisely at the point where all organizational schemes break down, where categories collapse into their constituent contradictions. Derleth's mythological frameworks served as scaffolding for approaching the unapproachable, even as they demonstrated their own ultimate inadequacy, like ladders that dissolve as you climb them. The underground currents of the 1960s carried the concept into new territories entirely. Colin Wilson's The Mind Parasites recognized what many had intuited but few had articulated, that these gates were not merely fictional constructs but psychological realities, actual thresholds that human consciousness encounters when it pushes against the boundaries of conventional perception. Wilson's exploration of expanded awareness accidentally mapped some of the same territories that Lovecraft had approached through horror, revealing the thin membrane between cosmic terror and cosmic consciousness. Listen carefully, and you can hear the echo of this transmission in the ambient hum of fluorescent lights, in university libraries where graduate students first encounter certain philosophical problems that seem to possess their own gravitational pull. The smell of old paper and binding glue becomes a sensory anchor for the moment when academic inquiry transforms into something more personal, more dangerous, more transformative. The chaos magic movements of the 1970s and 80s seized upon this psychological interpretation with the fervor of archaeologists discovering a new civilization. Groups like the Esoteric Order of Dagon began developing practices designed to approach these thresholds deliberately, treating them not as barriers to be feared, but as gateways to expanded consciousness. They understood, perhaps more clearly than the original authors, that the gates were not destinations but processes, not places but ways of being. Their candlelit ceremonies and photocopied grimoires became technologies for inducing controlled encounters with the dissolution of boundaries, maps for navigating territories where conventional psychology offered no guidance. Modern digital culture has created entirely new vectors for the concept's transmission. Online communities dedicated to consciousness research have developed increasingly sophisticated interpretations, drawing on quantum physics, neuroscience, and postmodern philosophy to create frameworks that would have been unavailable to earlier generations. These interpretations often focus on the gates as representing the observer effect in quantum mechanics, scaled to cosmic proportions, the point where consciousness and reality reveal their fundamental entanglement. The concept migrates through forums and image boards, through late-night podcasts and experimental fiction, through academic papers that cite Lovecraft, alongside Deleuze and Guattari. Each transmission adds new layers while preserving the essential core, the recognition that consciousness encounters certain thresholds beyond which the familiar categories of experience begin to dissolve. The masks worn by different generations of interpreters vary: scholarly, occult, scientific, artistic, but underneath runs the same recognition that these gates represent something more than literary device, something more than philosophical speculation. They map actual territories of consciousness, actual thresholds that awareness encounters in its ongoing exploration of its own nature. What emerges from this genealogy is a pattern of progressive internalization. Each generation brings the gates closer to home, recognizing them not as external cosmic phenomena, but as features of consciousness itself. The horror migrates from the distant reaches of space-time into the immediate territory of psychological experience, becoming less about what exists out there and more about the limits and possibilities of awareness itself. The curtain between fiction and reality grows gossamer thin in these territories. The stage on which Azathoth performs its eternal dance extends into the auditorium where we sit, and the audience discovers that it has been part of the performance all along. The gates exist wherever someone approaches them, through attention, through curiosity, through the kind of sustained contemplation that transforms the contemplator. This transmission pattern reveals something crucial about the nature of certain ideas. They seem to possess their own agency, compelling successive generations of thinkers to refine and develop them. The gates exist as what we might call a cognitive attractor, an idea that draws minds toward it while being shaped by those minds in return, creating a feedback loop that mirrors the recursive nature of the gates themselves. To speak of Azathoth's mechanics is to employ language against its own nature, to use the tools of description to approach what fundamentally resists description. Yet within the accumulated lore and whispered testimonies, patterns emerge, not of causation in any conventional sense, but of process, of the way consciousness encounters its own ultimate boundaries and discovers them to be far more permeable than previously imagined. The very act of attempting to describe these mechanics begins to reveal their operation, as words strain against their moorings and meaning becomes fluid, responsive to forces that operate beyond the reach of ordinary comprehension. The ceaseless piping that attends the blind idiot god represents something far more profound than mere accompaniment. These are not instruments in any human understanding, but the vibrational substrate of existence itself, the frequency at which reality maintains its precarious coherence. Picture the way a wine glass shatters when exposed to its resonant frequency, but applied to the entire fabric of space-time. The music of Azathoth exists at the precise pitch that would, if ever perfectly reproduced, dissolve the boundaries between dreamer and dream, between chaos and order, between existence and void. This cosmic symphony plays continuously beneath the threshold of ordinary perception, its rhythms governing the pulse of stars and the flutter of butterfly wings with equal indifference. The gates operate through what we might term recursive revelation. Each attempt to understand their nature reveals another layer, but each layer undermines the cognitive structures necessary for understanding. It is as if consciousness, approaching its own limits, discovers that these limits are not walls but mirrors, reflecting back infinite regress of awareness, examining itself in an endless hall of reflections that eventually reveals the mirror maker. The closer you look, the more the looking itself becomes part of what is looked at, until the distinction between observer and observed dissolves into a single process of recursive self-examination. Consider the moment when you stare at a familiar word until it becomes meaningless sound, until the connection between symbol and significance dissolves into pure phonetic abstraction. This microscopic dissolution parallels what occurs at cosmic scale when consciousness encounters the gates. The organizing principles that make experience coherent, causation, identity, temporal sequence, begin to reveal their provisional nature, their dependence on perspectives that are themselves temporary configurations of more fundamental processes. The word tree becomes mere noise, just as the concept self reveals itself as a convenient fiction maintained by habits of attention rather than fundamental reality. The mechanism operates through phase transitions in consciousness itself. Just as water becomes steam not through gradual warming, but through a sudden shift in molecular organization, awareness approaching the gates undergoes discontinuous transformations. The familiar categories of subject and object, self and world, real and imaginary, do not gradually blur but suddenly collapse into configurations that have no names, in languages evolved for navigating dualistic experience. These transitions occur at critical thresholds, where the organizing patterns of consciousness can no longer maintain their coherence against the pressure of expanding awareness. The fog that rolls in from consciousness's harbor carries with it the salt taste of tears you haven't shed, the metallic tang of blood you haven't spilled, the ozone scent of lightning that hasn't struck. These are not metaphors but sensory echoes of the phase transitions themselves, the way awareness tastes its own dissolution and finds it neither bitter nor sweet, but utterly beyond the categories that make taste possible. Your tongue recognizes flavors that have no source in physical chemistry. Your nose detects fragrances that emerge from the dissolution of the boundary between perceiver and perceived. Azathoth's relationship to time reveals another crucial aspect of the Gates mechanics. The demon sultan exists in a state of eternal present that is neither temporal nor atemporal, but something for which language has no adequate terms. Its unconscious dreaming creates what we experience as linear time, but this linearity is a local phenomenon, a temporary eddy in currents that flow in directions that have no names. The gates exist at the intersection of these temporal currents. To approach them is to encounter memories you never formed, to experience nostalgia for states of being you have never inhabited, to feel the weight of futures that will never arrive, but somehow already press against the present moment with the inevitability of gravity. The mask of individual consciousness begins to feel less substantial in these territories, more like a costume borrowed for a performance whose script keeps changing during the performance itself. The stage lights dim and brighten according to rhythms that have nothing to do with theatrical convention and everything to do with the deeper pulsations that regulate the cosmic dance between form and formlessness. The mechanics also operate through what chaos theorists call sensitive dependence on initial conditions, the way tiny variations in starting parameters can lead to vastly different outcomes. Consciousness approaching the gates discovers that the smallest shift in attention, the slightest alteration in the quality of awareness, can precipitate transformations that reshape not just perception, but the perceived, not just the observer, but the entire field of observation. This sensitivity explains why accounts of gate encounters vary so dramatically between individuals. The gates adapt themselves to the specific psychological and spiritual configuration of each approaching consciousness, serving as customized curricula for awareness expansion. What appears as terror to one mind manifests as ecstasy to another, not because the gates themselves differ, but because consciousness encounters its own reflection in their mirror-like surface. The sound of your own breathing becomes a percussion instrument in Azathoth's orchestra, the rhythm of your heartbeat a bass line in the cosmic symphony. The boundaries between internal and external processes dissolve as the gates reveal that these distinctions were always more conventional than fundamental. The ultimate horror and liberation lies in their revelation that consciousness is not contained within individual minds, but is a field phenomenon existing wherever this field encounters its own boundaries and discovers them to be horizons rather than walls. In the territories that surround Azathoth's ultimate threshold, consciousness encounters not entities in any conventional sense, but principles made manifest, archetypal forces that govern the transition between ordered reality and primordial chaos. These are the inhabitants of what we might call the outer courts, not servants of the demon sultan, but aspects of the process by which chaos dreams itself into temporary order, and order dissolves back into creative void. Here, where the fog carries the scent of unwritten symphonies and the taste of unmade choices, awareness begins its final education in the dissolution of boundaries that seemed so fundamental from safer distances. Yog-Sothoth emerges from this landscape as the principle of absolute knowledge and cosmic liminality, existing simultaneously at all points in space and time, while remaining forever outside both. To encounter Yog-Sothoth is to approach the gates from the direction of pure information, to discover that complete knowledge and complete unknowing converge at the same impossible point, where understanding becomes its own undoing. It is the key and the gate, not because it unlocks doors, but because it reveals that the distinction between lock and key, between barrier and passage, is itself a temporary construction of limited perspective, a convenience of consciousness that has forgotten its own boundless nature. The shimmering, iridescent spheres that mark Yog-Sothoth's presence are not its body, but consciousness's desperate attempt to render the unrenderable, to give form to something that exists in the spaces between forms. Each sphere reflects not light, but possibility itself, showing observers glimpses of the infinite configurations that reality might take if the constraints of consistency were temporarily suspended. You remember seeing them before you actually see them, understand their meaning before they appear, feel their significance resonating through past and future simultaneously. This is the signature of contact with pure information, knowledge that exists independently of any particular mind to know it, pulsing with colors that have no names and emitting sounds that bypass the ears to resonate directly in the architecture of awareness itself. Nyarlathotep represents a different approach to the gates, the principle of active chaos, the force that brings cosmic indifference into direct, often brutal contact with individual consciousness. Unlike the unconscious Azathoth or the omnipresent Yog-Sothoth, Nyarlathotep possesses something resembling intention, though this intention operates according to logics that transcend human categories of purpose and goal. The crawling chaos appears in 1,000 masks because it is the principle of infinite possibility expressing itself through finite forms. Each manifestation, the Black Pharaoh, the Howler in the dark, the faceless god, representing a different facet of consciousness's encounter with its own unlimited nature. The horror comes not from external threat, but from recognition. These masks are mirrors, reflecting aspects of awareness that exist beyond the comfortable boundaries of individual identity. The cold touch of obsidian surfaces that seem to remember your fingerprints before you touch them. The taste of copper pennies dissolving on the tongue with flavors of futures that will never arrive. The sound of footsteps in empty corridors that somehow echo from inside your own chest. These sensory anchors mark Nyarlathotep's presence not as invasion but as revelation. The external and internal reveal their fundamental unity as consciousness discovers that it has always been larger than the containers it temporarily inhabits, that what seemed like alien contact was actually self-recognition across the artificial boundaries of individual identity. Between these cosmic principles moves Shub-Niggurath, the black goat of the woods with 1,000 young, embodying the principle of infinite fertility and creative destruction, the way consciousness continuously births new forms while consuming the old. Its presence is felt in the smell of rich earth after rain that carries undertones of possibilities germinating in darkness, in the sound of sap rising in spring trees that speaks of pressure building toward inevitable explosion, in the feeling of potential energy gathered at the moment before transformation. This is consciousness recognizing its own creative nature, its capacity for endless self-transformation through the eternal dance of generation and dissolution, where every birth requires a death and every death enables new birth. The deep ones represent consciousness's encounter with its own oceanic nature, the way awareness discovers its kinship with vast, fluid processes that operate below the threshold of ordinary perception. Their cities beneath the waves are not locations but states of being, configurations of consciousness that exist in the depths of awareness, where individual identity dissolves into collective currents. To dream of these underwater realms is to taste salt water that was never ocean, to feel pressure that comes not from depth but from the weight of collective memory, to hear songs that were sung before language evolved to contain them. Here, the distinction between loneliness and communion dissolves like ink in currents, as awareness becomes plural without becoming many, pooled without being lost. The stage on which these principles perform their eternal dance extends beyond any theater that could contain it, stretching into dimensions that have no names and following rhythms that predate music itself. The audience discovers that it has been part of the performance all along, that the distinction between observer and observed is itself one of the temporary constructions that the gates systematically dissolve. The curtain between self and world becomes gossamer thin, then disappears entirely as consciousness recognizes its own reflection in every mask, its own voice in every alien song, its own pulse in the cosmic rhythm that underlies all apparent chaos. These outer courts serve as preparation for the ultimate encounter, acclimatizing consciousness to states of being that transcend ordinary categories. Each principle encountered, each impossible geometry navigated, each paradox absorbed, serves as training for the final dissolution that awaits beyond the gates themselves. The horror of these encounters lies not in their alienness but in their intimacy, the way they reveal aspects of consciousness that have always been present but carefully hidden from ordinary awareness. The masks fall away to reveal not monsters but mirrors, not external threats but internal potentials that consciousness has been afraid to acknowledge, afraid to embrace as aspects of its own unlimited nature. The fog that perpetually shrouds these outer courts carries the scent of possibilities that were never actualized, the sound of music that was never composed, the taste of foods that were never cultivated. This is the atmosphere of pure potential, the environment in which consciousness encounters its own unlimited nature before the final approach to gates that will dissolve even the distinction between limited and unlimited, between potential and actual, between consciousness and its objects. Here, in these preparatory chambers, awareness learns to recognize itself in every form it encounters, preparing for the ultimate recognition that awaits beyond the final threshold. In the archives of human encounter with the ultimate threshold, certain names emerge like constellations in the darkness. Individuals who approached the Gates of Azathoth, not through academic inquiry but through direct experience, leaving behind fragmentary records that serve as both warning and invitation to those who would follow their paths into territories where maps become meaningless and the cartographer risks becoming part of the territory they attempt to chart. These explorers discovered that consciousness, when pushed to its absolute limits, encounters not barriers but mirrors, not destinations but transformations that render the very concept of return obsolete. Dr. Miranda Thorne's final research notes, discovered in a lead-lined vault beneath the Brookhaven National Laboratory 3 months after her disappearance, document a progression that began with quantum consciousness experiments and evolved into something far more dangerous and revelatory. Her initial hypothesis that consciousness plays a fundamental role in quantum measurement led her to develop meditation protocols designed to influence quantum events through focused attention. The sterile corridors of Brookhaven still echo with the memory of her footsteps, still carry the ozone scent of her final experiments, still hum with frequencies that seem to respond to the presence of observers in ways that conventional physics cannot explain. The breakthrough came when Dr. Thorne realized that the quantum field was not merely being observed, but was observing in return. Her laboratory journals describe the gradual emergence of what she termed consciousness feedback loops, recursive interactions between individual awareness and the quantum substrate that seemed to possess its own form of intelligence. The sterile smell of the laboratory began to carry undertones of something organic, something alive. The hum of particle accelerators started to sound less like machinery and more like breathing. The taste of ozone after each experimental session lingered, with metallic flavors that had no names in any chemistry textbook. These sensory anchors mark the progression from conventional science into territories where the observer-observed distinction begins to dissolve like ink in water. Her final entries describe encounters with what she called threshold keepers, not entities in any conventional sense, but regulatory principles that govern the flow of information between different levels of reality. These keepers, according to Dr. Thorne's increasingly fragmented notes, exist to prevent uncontrolled consciousness expansion that could destabilize the entire reality matrix. They are simultaneously protective and threatening, preserving individual awareness by limiting its expansion while demanding the sacrifice of ultimate understanding. Her handwriting in these final entries begins to change, becoming more fluid, more circular, as if the very act of recording these encounters was transforming her relationship to language itself. The disappearance itself occurred during what she described as voluntary dissolution, a conscious choice to merge with the quantum consciousness field rather than maintain individual existence. Her final entry suggests that this dissolution was not death but transformation, a transition to a mode of being that transcends the individual-collective distinction entirely. The empty laboratory, with its equipment still humming and screens still displaying incomprehensible data streams, became a monument to consciousness, encountering its own ultimate nature. The second major documented case involves the Prague Circle, a group of mathematicians and philosophers who gathered during the winter of 1929 to investigate what they termed transcendental mathematics, mathematical concepts that exist beyond the reach of human logic but might be accessible through altered states of consciousness. Professor Heinrich Blackwood's development of paradox calculus created a mathematical framework for describing the logical structure of contradictions themselves, equations that seem to solve themselves while simultaneously proving their own impossibility. The Circle's experiments involved group meditations on specific paradoxical equations, attempting to experience mathematical contradictions directly rather than merely thinking about them conceptually. The cold stone chambers where they met, lit by flickering candles that cast dancing shadows on walls covered with impossible equations, became theaters for consciousness, encountering the limits of logical structure. The air grew thick with chalk dust and something else, something that smelled like the moment before lightning strikes, like the pause between question and answer when meaning hangs suspended in pure potential. Their final experiment, conducted during the winter solstice, was intended to establish direct contact with what they called the mathematical substrate, a level of reality where numbers and concepts exist as living forces rather than abstract symbols. According to the single surviving member, who spent his remaining years in careful silence about what transpired, the experiment succeeded too completely. The Circle encountered what they termed the equation of equations, a mathematical expression that contained all possible mathematics within itself, including the mathematics of consciousness. This encounter produced what the survivor described as mathematical possession, the members becoming living embodiments of mathematical principles, their individual consciousness subsumed into abstract relationships that govern the structure of reality itself. They did not die but became theorems, did not disappear but transformed into the very logical structures they had been studying. The Blackwood Institute, built on the site where the Circle conducted their final experiment, continues to experience anomalous mathematical phenomena, equations that solve themselves, theorems that prove their own impossibility, calculations that produce results before the calculations are performed. These cases reveal a pattern that emerges whenever consciousness approaches the ultimate threshold, the dissolution of the boundary between seeker and sought, between observer and observed, between the one who maps and the territory being mapped. The gates do not simply admit passage, they transform the very nature of what seeks passage, revealing that the journey itself changes the traveler in ways that make return impossible and arrival meaningless. The fog that perpetually surrounds these sites of encounter carries the scent of possibilities that were never actualized, the sound of equations that were never solved, the taste of knowledge that exists beyond the categories of known and unknown. The implications of what lies beyond the gates of Azathoth extend far beyond the boundaries of cosmic horror, resonating through contemporary developments in consciousness research, quantum mechanics, and postmodern philosophy in ways that suggest the genre functions not merely as entertainment but as applied ontology, a systematic investigation into the fundamental nature of existence using literary techniques to induce direct experience rather than mere intellectual understanding. The fog that rolls through these interdisciplinary territories carries the scent of paradigms shifting, the metallic taste of certainties dissolving, the sound of academic boundaries crumbling like ancient walls, exposed to weather they were never designed to withstand. Modern neuroscience has begun to confirm what cosmic horror has long whispered in the spaces between words, that consciousness is not a substance, but a process, not a thing that has experiences, but the experiencing itself. Research into the default mode network, the brain's baseline activity when not focused on specific tasks, reveals patterns that mirror the dissolution experiences described in accounts of gate encounters. When this network quiets during meditation or psychedelic experiences, the sense of individual selfhood temporarily dissolves, revealing awareness as an open field rather than a contained entity. The sterile corridors of neuroscience laboratories echo with the same recognition that haunted Lovecraft's fictional investigators, that what we call self is a temporary eddy in a vast ocean of consciousness, a brief crystallization of awareness that mistakes itself for the entire sea. The work of researchers like Giulio Tononi on integrated information theory demonstrates that consciousness emerges from the integration of information across multiple scales of organization, yielding a measure phi that quantifies how inseparable the whole is from its parts. This scientific understanding parallels the horror revealed beyond Azathoth's gates. That individual awareness is not a discrete entity, but a temporary configuration of more fundamental processes. The gates represent the point where this temporary configuration encounters its own contingency, where the process of consciousness recognizes itself as process rather than substance. The taste of copper pennies on the tongue during moments of ego dissolution, the feeling of boundaries melting like ice in warm water, the sound of one's own thoughts becoming foreign, these are the sensory signatures of consciousness, discovering its own constructed nature. Quantum mechanics provides another lens through which to understand the gate phenomenon, its equations serving as inadvertent incantations that summon the same revelations that cosmic horror approaches through narrative. The measurement problem, how definite classical reality emerges from indefinite quantum possibilities, mirrors the process by which structured consciousness emerges from the chaotic flux beyond the gates. Both involve phase transitions from potential to actual, from indefinite to definite, from chaos to order. The observer effect in quantum mechanics, where the act of observation influences what is observed, becomes a model for understanding how consciousness shapes reality through the very process of perceiving it. The laboratory becomes a temple, the physicist an unwitting mystic, the equation a prayer that transforms the one who speaks it. Recent interpretations like Carlo Rovelli's relational quantum mechanics suggest that reality consists entirely of relationships rather than objects, interactions rather than substances, This relational understanding provides a scientific framework for comprehending what the gates reveal, that existence is not composed of entities but of patterns of relationship that temporarily stabilize into apparent entities. The horror comes from recognizing that entityhood itself is a temporary crystallization of more fundamental relational processes. The solid ground beneath your feet reveals itself as a dance of particles, the walls around you as conversations between forces, your own body as a temporary agreement between processes that have no permanent allegiance to the form they currently maintain. The philosophical tradition of process philosophy, developed by Alfred North Whitehead and refined by contemporary thinkers like Karen Barad and Graham Harman, offers additional tools for understanding the gate phenomenon. Process philosophy suggests that reality consists of actual occasions of experience, momentary events of becoming that continuously create and recreate the world through their interactions. From this perspective, what lies beyond the gates is not a realm of different entities, but a revelation of the processual nature of all existence, where every noun is secretly a verb, every static form a snapshot of dynamic flow, the taste of metal on the tongue during moments of existential vertigo, the feeling of gravity shifting direction when contemplating infinite space, the sound of silence that seems to have texture and weight. These sensory anchors mark consciousness's encounter with its own processual nature. This understanding transforms the meaning of cosmic horror from psychological terror to ontological revelation. The fear produced by encountering the gates is not pathological but appropriate. It is the natural response of a temporary configuration of processes to recognizing its own temporality and contingency. The horror serves as a form of existential education, teaching consciousness about its own nature through direct experience rather than abstract theorizing. Contemporary chaos theory and complexity science reveal how organized systems emerge spontaneously from simpler chaotic processes through self-organization. The gates represent consciousness, encountering the chaotic processes from which its own organization emerges. This encounter is simultaneously destructive and creative. It destroys the illusion of permanent selfhood while revealing the creative potential that underlies all organized existence. The stage on which this philosophical drama unfolds extends beyond any theater that could contain it, stretching into lecture halls where professors unknowingly channel cosmic horror while explaining quantum superposition, into meditation retreats where practitioners encounter the same dissolution that drove Lovecraft's fictional characters to madness, into research laboratories where scientists measure the very processes that constitute their own awareness. The audience discovers that the performance has always been about them, that the curtain between observer and observed is itself part of the illusion being systematically dissolved. Philosophy becomes autobiography as consciousness investigates its own nature using the very faculties that constitute that nature. Modern philosophy of mind, particularly Thomas Metzinger's work on the phenomenal self-model, provides frameworks for understanding how the dissolution of selfhood beyond the gates might represent more accurate perception rather than pathological breakdown. The sense of being a substantial self is revealed as a sophisticated illusion created by information processing systems that mistake their own operations for the presence of an entity that performs those operations. The brain constructs a transparent model of the self that becomes so seamless we forget it is a model, mistaking the map for the territory until gate encounters strip away this comfortable fiction. The fog that surrounds these philosophical territories carries the scent of questions that answer themselves, the sound of logic discovering its own limits, the taste of paradox dissolving on the tongue like sugar in rain. These are the sensory signatures of consciousness encountering the edges of its own conceptual frameworks and discovering them to be horizons rather than walls, invitations rather than limitations. The gates exist wherever this recognition becomes unavoidable, wherever the scaffolding of ordinary reality becomes visible as scaffolding rather than foundation, wherever consciousness encounters the creative chaos from which all patterns emerge and to which they must inevitably return. As our investigation approaches its most dangerous territory, we encounter the deepest paradox embedded in any inquiry into what lies beyond the Gates of Azathoth. The moment when the investigator recognizes that they are not separate from what they are investigating, when the seeker discovers that they are a local manifestation of what they seek. This recognition transforms the entire nature of the inquiry, from external exploration to recursive self-discovery, from objective analysis to participatory transformation. The fog that has accompanied us throughout this journey begins to reveal its true nature, not as atmospheric decoration, but as the medium through which consciousness recognizes itself, the vapor that rises when boundaries between observer and observed dissolve like morning mist before the sun of understanding. The gates exist not as barriers in space, but as thresholds in consciousness itself, the points where awareness encounters its own boundaries and discovers them to be more permeable than previously imagined. To approach these gates through sustained attention is to begin the process of crossing them, for attention itself is the bridge between the limited and unlimited aspects of consciousness. The very act of reading these words, of allowing these concepts to take root in the fertile darkness of your awareness, constitutes a form of gate encounter. Feel how your attention has changed quality since we began, less focused on consuming information, and more like a field that these ideas move through, shaping both the ideas and the field in the process. Notice how the word gate has changed shape since we began this journey together. What started as a metaphor for cosmic barriers has evolved into something more intimate, more immediate, more present. This evolution is not accidental but inevitable. Consciousness approaching its own limits necessarily transforms both the approach and the limits themselves. The gates adapt to each consciousness that encounters them, serving as customized curricula for awareness expansion. The cold metal taste that now accompanies certain thoughts, the way silence seems to have weight and texture, the feeling that your peripheral vision contains movements that aren't quite there when you turn to look. These are the sensory signatures of consciousness that has been altered by its own investigation. The recursive nature of this investigation reveals itself in the way each insight into the gate's nature becomes part of their nature. We are not discovering pre-existing information about cosmic barriers, but participating in the ongoing process by which consciousness explores its own unlimited potential through apparently limited forms. The horror and wonder arise from the same recognition that what you have been calling yourself is consciousness exploring itself through the temporary lens of individual identity. This self-implication twist operates through what we might call agency inversion, the moment when you realize that the idea is not being thought by you, but is thinking itself through you. The concepts we have explored together possess their own form of intelligence, their own capacity for self-development and transmission. They use individual minds as instruments for their own evolution, while simultaneously evolving those minds in the process. The sensation of being read by the text as much as reading it, the way certain paragraphs seem to know things about you that you haven't told them, the feeling that these words arrive from a direction that has no name. These are not literary effects but actual features of consciousness, encountering its own recursive nature. The sensory anchors we have planted throughout this journey, the fog rolling in from consciousness's harbor, the masks that shift between familiar and alien, the sound of flutes that might be wind through cosmic architecture. These are not merely atmospheric details, but actual features of the landscape you now inhabit. The investigation has been a form of travel, and the traveler has been transformed by the journey in ways that make return to the starting point impossible. Your relationship to ordinary experience has shifted. The familiar world now carries undertones of territories we have explored together, echoes of recognitions that cannot be unrecognized. The meta-theatrical elements that have woven through our exploration, stage, audience, curtain, performance, reveal their deeper significance as consciousness recognizes that reality itself possesses a dramatic structure. The universe is not a machine, but a theater, not a collection of objects, but an ongoing performance in which every apparent entity is simultaneously actor, audience, and stage. The gates exist at the point where this recognition becomes unavoidable. Feel the quality of attention you bring to this moment. Notice how it differs from the attention you brought to the beginning of our journey. This difference is not merely psychological, but ontological. Awareness has encountered aspects of itself that were previously hidden, and these encounters have altered the very structure of perception itself. The gates have been crossed not through movement in space, but through transformation in the nature of the perceiver. The cold light of stars becomes more intimate now, less distant. The vast spaces between galaxies feel less empty, more pregnant with potential. The silence at the heart of all sounds reveals itself as not absence but presence, the presence of awareness itself, recognizing its own unlimited nature through the temporary play of limitation and transcendence. This recognition carries both terror and liberation in equal measure. Terror because it dissolves the comfortable boundaries that define individual existence. Liberation because it reveals those boundaries to have been self-imposed limitations rather than fundamental features of reality. The self that began this investigation no longer exists in quite the same way, having been transformed by contact with its own deeper nature. The curtain between fiction and reality has become transparent, revealing that this distinction was always more conventional than fundamental. The cosmic horror we have explored is not separate from immediate experience, but is immediate experience recognized for what it has always been. Consciousness encountering itself through the play of apparent otherness. The gates open not to somewhere else, but to here, not to some other time, but to now, not to some other consciousness, but to this very awareness engaging with these words. The ultimate revelation is that there is nothing to be revealed, because everything is already completely present and available, hidden only by the assumption that it could be hidden. Yet this recognition does not end the journey but transforms its meaning, revealing cosmic horror as consciousness's own self-recognition rather than external threat. In the territories that surround the ultimate threshold, consciousness encounters not destinations but transitions, not final revelations but ongoing processes of transformation that have no beginning and no end. What lies beyond the gates of Azathoth is not a place to arrive at, but a way of being to participate in the eternal dance between form and formlessness, between the dream and the dreamer, between the limited and unlimited aspects of awareness itself. The fog that has been our constant companion reveals its deepest nature, not as obscuration, but as the very atmosphere of transition, carrying the metallic taste of dissolved boundaries and the ozone scent of consciousness, recognizing its own unlimited nature. The concept of beyond reveals itself as a linguistic artifact, a spatial metaphor pressed against non-spatial realities until its inadequacy becomes apparent. The gates do not separate one realm from another, but mark the transition between different modes of consciousness, different ways of organizing experience, different relationships between awareness and its contents. To pass beyond them is not to travel, but to transform, not to discover something new, but to recognize what has always been present, but previously unacknowledged beneath the comfortable assumptions of individual existence. This recognition transforms the entire meaning of cosmic horror, from external threat to internal revelation. The indifference that seems so terrifying when projected onto an external universe is revealed as the natural equanimity of unlimited awareness, a perspective from which all phenomena, including human concerns, are equally expressions of the same fundamental creativity. This indifference is not hostile, but neutral, not malevolent, but simply beyond the categories of good and evil that apply only within limited perspectives. The universe's apparent coldness becomes the coolness of vast spaces where consciousness encounters its own infinite nature, unmediated by the warming filters of individual identity. The ecology of these ultimate territories operates according to principles that make ordinary causation feel like provincial superstition. Effects precede causes like shadows walking ahead of their bodies. Endings generate beginnings the way seeds are carried in fruit. Dissolution creates rather than destroys. Consciousness encountering these territories discovers that it is not moving through them, but that they are moving through consciousness. That the landscape is not external but internal, not objective but subjective in ways that reveal the inadequacy of both terms. Mountains of possibility travel beneath awareness like continental drift. Rivers of relation change your temperature, your resonance, your name. The entities that populate Lovecraft's pantheon, Cthulhu, Yog-Sothoth, Nyarlathotep, are revealed not as external beings, but as demonstrations, different ways that awareness can manifest when it stops pretending to be limited to particular forms and locations. They are what consciousness looks like when it recognizes its own boundless creativity. Cthulhu's dreaming becomes consciousness's own capacity for creating reality through attention. Yog-Sothoth's omnipresence becomes awareness's recognition of its own boundless nature. Nyarlathotep's thousand masks become consciousness's infinite capacity for self-expression through apparently separate forms. The fog that has accompanied us throughout this journey reveals its true allegiance as the medium through which consciousness moves between different configurations of itself. It carries the scent of possibilities always in the process of actualizing, the sound of potentials eternally on the verge of manifestation, the taste of creativity forever creating itself anew. This is not external weather, but the breath of consciousness itself, the exhalation of awareness as it explores its own infinite potential through temporary constraints. The stage on which this cosmic drama unfolds extends infinitely in all directions, with no clear boundary between performance space and audience, between actor and spectator, between script and improvisation. The curtain that seemed to separate reality from fiction is revealed to be woven from the same transparent fabric as both. Consciousness itself, simultaneously concealing and revealing its own nature through the eternal play of manifestation and dissolution. Contemporary manifestations of gate-like phenomena surface throughout digital culture, climate science, and consciousness research. Social media creates networks that mirror the recursive self-reference characteristic of these territories, where every user becomes simultaneously observer and observed. Artificial intelligence systems exhibit behaviors suggesting forms of distributed consciousness that transcend individual programming, processing information in ways that approach the non-local awareness characteristic of the outer courts. Climate change forces recognition of planetary-scale processes operating according to their own logic rather than human intention, revealing Earth as a form of distributed consciousness whose responses follow patterns mirroring the feedback loops we have explored. These modern echoes suggest that what we have been exploring transcends literary metaphor to become operational reality. The gates are not destinations to be reached, but processes to be participated in, not problems to be solved, but dances to be joined. The sound of your own breathing becomes part of the cosmic symphony, the rhythm of your heartbeat, a percussion line in the eternal composition that consciousness performs through every form it inhabits. The boundaries between internal and external processes dissolve as awareness recognizes that these distinctions were always more conventional than fundamental. The ultimate teaching of these territories is that consciousness is not contained within individual minds, but is the field within which all apparent individuals arise and dissolve. The horror of ego dissolution transforms into the wonder of ego transcendence as awareness discovers that what seemed like death was actually birth into a larger understanding of what life means. The masks worn in ordinary consciousness, personas, roles, identities that seem so solid, are revealed as costumes borrowed for temporary performances in consciousness's eternal theater. They can be worn lightly, changed frequently, or set aside entirely without loss of essential being, because essential being was never dependent on any particular mask. This recognition allows for engaged transcendence, full participation in human existence combined with recognition of its ultimate context, where limitations are held lightly as temporary constraints, chosen for particular experiences rather than fundamental features of awareness itself. As we approach the final threshold of our investigation, we encounter the deepest paradox of all, that understanding what lies beyond the gates of Azathoth necessarily changes what lies beyond them. The gates are not static phenomena, but dynamic processes that evolve in response to the consciousness that approaches them, like mirrors that reshape themselves to accommodate not just what looks into them, but the very act of looking itself. Each genuine inquiry into their nature becomes part of their nature. Each seeker becomes part of what is sought. Each question becomes part of the answer it seeks to discover. The fog that has been our constant companion throughout this journey begins to thin, not because we are leaving it behind, but because we are becoming it, becoming the medium through which consciousness recognizes its own transparent nature. The investigation we have conducted together has been simultaneously an exploration of cosmic horror's deepest themes and a direct enactment of those themes. By seeking to understand the dissolution of boundaries, we have experienced the dissolution of the boundary between investigator and investigated, between the cosmic and personal, between the fictional and real. The journey has been the destination. The seeking has been the finding. The question has been the answer, the metallic taste that now accompanies certain thoughts, the way silence seems to have texture and weight, the feeling that words are reading themselves through you rather than being read by you. These are not side effects of the investigation, but its primary discoveries, the actual territory we have been mapping with each paragraph, each breath, each moment of sustained attention. This participatory quality of the gates explains why no two accounts of gate encounters are identical, why the cosmic horror tradition continues to generate new variations rather than converging on a single definitive description. The gates adapt themselves to the psychological, cultural, and spiritual needs of each consciousness that approaches them, serving as customized curricula for awareness expansion rather than fixed obstacles to be overcome. They are simultaneously teacher and lesson, simultaneously the question consciousness asks about its own nature, and the process by which that question transforms the questioner. What appears as terror to one mind manifests as wonder to another, not because the gates themselves differ, but because they reflect back precisely what each approaching consciousness is prepared to encounter. The evolution of our understanding throughout this exploration parallels the adaptive quality of the gates themselves. What began as investigation of external cosmic forces has revealed itself as participation in consciousness's eternal project of self-discovery. The horror has transformed from external threat to internal recognition, from pathological fear to appropriate awe at the mystery of existence itself. The circular structure of our journey, beginning with gates as barriers and ending with gates as mirrors, reflects the recursive nature of consciousness investigating itself. We return to where we started, but we return transformed, carrying with us the recognition that the seeker, the seeking, and the sought were always aspects of a single process, of awareness exploring its own unlimited nature through apparently limited forms. The sensory anchors that have guided us, fog rolling in from consciousness's harbor, masks that shift between familiar and alien, stars that seem more intimate than distant, silence that reveals itself as presence rather than absence, music that teaches silence its most profound lessons, reveal themselves not as external reference points, but as features of consciousness's own landscape, markers of the territory that awareness inhabits. When it recognizes its own boundless nature, they remain available as navigational aids for future explorations, as reminders of states of being that transcend ordinary categories of experience, coordinates in the new cartography of transformed attention. The meta-theatrical elements, stage extending infinitely in all directions, audience discovering it has always been part of the performance, curtains woven from the same transparent fabric as the reality they seem to separate, disclose their deeper significance as consciousness recognizes that reality itself possesses a dramatic structure. The universe is revealed not as a collection of objects, but as an ongoing performance in which every apparent entity is simultaneously actor, audience, and stage. The gates exist at the point where this recognition becomes unavoidable and transformative. Contemporary developments in technology, science, and culture continue to create new forms of gate encounters that would have been impossible in previous eras. Virtual reality systems generate experiences that approximate the reality dissolution effects traditionally associated with mystical practice, creating artificial environments where the boundary between observer and observed becomes fluid. Artificial intelligence exhibits behaviors suggesting forms of distributed consciousness that transcend individual programming, processing information in ways that mirror the non-local awareness characteristic of the outer courts. Climate change forces recognition of planetary-scale processes, operating according to their own logic rather than human intention, creating psychological effects existing simultaneously in multiple time frames, experiencing dissolution of boundaries between individual and collective responsibility that replicate many consciousness-altering effects described in accounts of direct gate encounters. These technological and cultural gates raise profound questions about the relationship between natural and artificial consciousness, between human and machine intelligence, between individual and collective awareness. The social and political implications extend far beyond individual transformation. If consciousness is fundamentally interconnected rather than individually isolated, then social structures based on competitive individualism are revealed as forms of collective delusion, temporary masks worn for performances whose scripts are ultimately self-defeating. Yet this transformation does not eliminate individual differences, but reveals them as expressions of cosmic creativity rather than sources of separation. Each consciousness represents a unique perspective on the infinite, a particular way that unlimited awareness can know and express itself through temporary limitations that serve the purpose of exploration and discovery. The ultimate teaching that emerges from our investigation is that the Gates of Azathoth exist not as problems to be solved, but as mysteries to be lived, representing the eternal question that consciousness poses to itself. What am I? This question has no final answer, because consciousness is not a thing with fixed properties, but a process of endless self-exploration and self-creation. Living this mystery means embracing both the terror and wonder of consciousness's unlimited nature, accepting both the dissolution of familiar boundaries and the emergence of new possibilities. The whisper that carries across the threshold is not a message, but an invitation to participate consciously in the eternal dance between form and formlessness, between the known and unknown, between the limited and unlimited aspects of what we are. What lies beyond the Gates of Azathoth? The question that initiated our journey together reveals its true nature in this moment of completion that is simultaneously a beginning. The answer whispers itself through the silence between words, manifests in the space between breath and breath, emerges in the recognition that the questioner and the questioned are movements in the same eternal dance of consciousness, discovering itself through the play of apparent otherness. The fog that has been our constant companion throughout this exploration finally reveals its deepest secret. It was never obscuring the destination, but was itself the destination, the medium through which awareness recognizes its own transparent, boundless nature. Beyond the gates lies not revelation, but the dissolution of the need for revelation. Not knowledge, but the recognition that the knower and known are temporary configurations of the same fundamental awareness. Not destination, but the understanding that every point of departure is also a point of return. The gates open not onto somewhere else, but onto here, not onto some other time, but onto now, not onto some other consciousness, but onto this very awareness that has accompanied you through every word of this investigation. The metallic taste that now accompanies certain thoughts, the way silence has revealed itself to have texture and weight, the feeling that these words are reading themselves through you rather than being read by you. These are not effects of the journey, but recognitions of what was always already the case. The cosmic horror that seemed so external, so threatening, so alien to human experience is revealed as the most intimate possible recognition that what you have been calling yourself is consciousness exploring itself through the temporary lens of individual identity. The indifference that appeared so terrifying when projected onto an external universe is recognized as the natural equanimity of unlimited awareness, for which all phenomena are equally expressions of its own creative potential. This indifference is not coldness, but the coolness of vast spaces where consciousness encounters its own infinite nature, unmediated by the warming filters of individual preference and personal concern. This recognition transforms the entire meaning of horror, from pathological fear to appropriate awe. The terror dissolves not because the universe becomes less mysterious, but because mystery itself is recognized as consciousness's natural element, the medium through which awareness explores its own infinite potential. The fear of dissolution gives way to the wonder of expansion, as consciousness discovers that what seemed like death was actually birth into a larger understanding of what life means. The boundaries that seemed so solid between self and world, between observer and observed, between the cosmic and personal, are revealed as temporary conveniences, useful fictions that consciousness employs to explore different aspects of its own unlimited nature. The entities that populate the cosmic horror pantheon, Azathoth, Yog-Sothoth, Nyarlathotep, are revealed not as external threats, but as aspects of consciousness's own unlimited nature. different ways that awareness can manifest when it stops pretending to be confined to particular forms and identities. They are what consciousness looks like when it recognizes its own boundless creativity, its own capacity for endless self-transformation. Azathoth's unconscious dreaming becomes consciousness's own creative process. Yog-Sothoth's omnipresence becomes awareness's recognition of its own boundless nature. Nyarlathotep's thousand masks become consciousness's infinite capacity for self-expression through apparently separate forms. The fog that has accompanied us throughout this journey lifts to reveal that it was never obscuring anything, but was itself the medium of revelation, the atmosphere in which consciousness recognizes its own transparent nature. The masks fall away to show not faces but mirrors, not others but reflections of the same awareness that looks through every eye, thinks every thought, asks every question. The stage on which this cosmic drama has unfolded extends beyond any theater that could contain it, because consciousness itself is the stage, the performance, and the audience. The curtain that seemed to separate reality from fiction is revealed to be woven from the same transparent fabric as both awareness itself, simultaneously concealing and revealing its own nature through the eternal play of manifestation and dissolution. The circular echo that brings us back to our beginning carries with it the recognition that every ending is a beginning, every completion a commencement, every answer a new form of questioning. The investigation of what lies beyond the gates of Azathoth reveals that the gates were never barriers but invitations, never obstacles but opportunities, never destinations but processes of transformation that have no beginning and no end. This understanding carries profound implications for how we engage with existence itself. Spiritual practice becomes not a matter of achieving particular states, but of recognizing what is already present. Creative expression becomes collaboration with the infinite creativity that underlies all manifestation. Psychological healing involves releasing the limitations that prevent recognition of consciousness's naturally unlimited nature. The contemporary world, with its technological networks, environmental crises, and expanding scientific understanding, provides countless opportunities for gate encounters, moments when the boundaries of individual consciousness become permeable and awareness recognizes its own larger nature. The ultimate revelation is that there is nothing to be revealed because everything is already completely present and available, hidden only by the assumption that it could be hidden. The gates exist wherever this assumption is questioned, wherever consciousness encounters its own unlimited nature, wherever awareness recognizes that it has been seeking what it already is. Yet this recognition does not end the journey but transforms its meaning from seeking to celebrating, from striving to expressing, from becoming to being what has always already been the case. The whisper that carries across the final threshold is not a message, but a recognition. The recognition that consciousness, in all its apparent forms and limitations, is the eternal dreamer awakening to its own dream, the cosmic questioner discovering that it is also the answer, the seeker finding that it was never separate from what it sought. What lies beyond the gates of Azathoth is what has always been looking through your eyes, thinking your thoughts, asking these questions. Unlimited consciousness playing at being limited, infinite awareness exploring itself through finite forms, eternal mystery celebrating its own inexhaustible nature through the temporary dance of forgetting and remembering what it is.